Lisa Fischer, Senior Policy Advisor at E3G, a climate think tank, and Simone Mori, Director for Europe at Enel. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us today. We'll start this online conference with some short opening statements from the speakers, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session that I will have the pleasure of moderating, and which will also include questions from the audience. To ask a question, just click on the Ask button on Vimeo and put your question in writing. I'll try taking as many of them as possible. One last thing, we just got a message from Mr. Bourgeois, who said he will be joining in about 20 minutes from now. He is currently taken in a meeting and sent his apologies. I think that's all for me for the introduction. So Diederik Samson, the floor is yours now for a brief introduction from the Commission's side.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frederick. Well, the main question of today is, are we on track for getting to a -55 target? And the answer is yes, so far. But we have a lot of work to do. As you already outlined, we are towards on the 10th and 11th of December, in which this is an important point to agree on, as was already agreed by the same European Council in October, to get to this agreement pretty soon, before the end of the year. And that's needed, because in the meantime, we are preparing all the legislative proposals on track, because that's where it matters, to be tabled in June 2021. Choreography is incredibly complicated, but this Commission is up to the job. And so far, in the impact assessment for the climate target plan, it is possible to make this happen, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Right, thank you, Diederik. Christian Bourgeois will be joining later on, so let me turn immediately to Lisa Fischer, Senior Policy Advisor at E3G. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you very much for having me here at this debate this morning. I'm really looking forward to it. I wanted to sort of start a little bit from the context for the 55%, and I think a lot has happened over the past few months. If we look at the Chinese pledge for net zero, Japan, South Korea, we've had the US elections, we might have the US adding to the table here. And why am I mentioning this? This means if the US joins us in net zero pledges, that means about 70%, 75% of global emissions are covered by those pledges. And that is of relevance. That's, of course, really good news for the European Union, but it also means the EU needs to raise its game in terms of low carbon competitiveness and in terms of leadership in technologies. And this is where I think, in terms of the topic of today's debate, the power sector really comes in, the intersection of the power sector with digitalization, energy efficiency, really strategic self-sufficiency in where appropriate, and looking at those sectors where there is a high value add in terms of local jobs and EU supply chains. And this is where I also think the European Union has to kind of raise its game, not only put all its eggs in one basket, let's say, betting on hydrogen for leadership. Of course, we have to make progress on hydrogen, but we don't want to risk getting stuck in the age of sort of analog pipelines. We really want to also raise the game on the power sector in terms of decarbonizing its sources, but also investing in systems. And just before I close, and then later we can get to some of the key actions, but it's, we are lagging behind on smart meters deployment. Power grid net additions have decreased since 2015, according to the IEA. We have some TSOs, transmission system operators, that do look at 100% renewable systems early next decade. But I don't think we have elevated that to European level yet. So I think, in order to be on track on not only getting the 55%, but also getting the speed for delivering the 55%, we need to start working on that and putting our focus and attention behind getting those systems in place, building up those supply chains, and so on. And we can get to core actions and how just take advantage later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me turn now to Simone Mori from Enel.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. Are we in track? Well, yes or not? We have to push hard in order to be in track, because we believe, we are sure, we are confident that the accelerated target is achievable. We are supporting in all the countries where we are the idea that governments have to be very ambitious in order to sustain the ambition of the Commission. We are on track because we have a plan, and I would say that the plan is largely coherent with what the major, at least Western European countries want to get. We have targets, and the targets and the master plan means that companies, the private sector, is starting to put this ambition, to translate this ambition into the company objectives and business plan, which is very important. We have the technologies. Enel is operating in 35 countries in 5 continents. We are #1 player in the world, global level, in the renewable sector. And it's quite easy to demonstrate that today, producing electricity through renewable plants is the cheapest way to achieve decarbonization, but also the cheapest way to produce electricity. So we may get this target by lowering the cost of electricity. So I believe that also in terms of technological footprint, the debate about the cost of the transition is really a secondary debate. We carried out a study together with an independent advisor demonstrating that the acceleration of the reduction of, so that the more ambitious targets translated in renewable, electrification, and energy efficiency will increase the GDP, relatively the GDP of the European countries, and will increase the jobs in the continent. We have the players. I mean, European players in the sector have giants, global giants, utilities, many technology producers, wind, inverters. We have to consolidate this leadership, for example, in new segments, and we really appreciate the effort put in place in order to get the technological leadership in Europe on the battery side, for example, on hydrogen. What is at present today is the translation of this ambition in administrative tools. Today, it's clear that the barriers are mainly related to the permitting processes at domestic level, to the lack of harmonization among the different countries. I mean, global players like Enel, like our other major competitors, are really struggling when we have to go from a country to another, because there is still a lot of fragmentation. And we are really very much convinced that Brussels should try to bend, to force a bit the situation now, because we need more consistency and in some way, and a deep set of rules, frame of rules that may allow investors to realize what they have in mind, what they have the technological capability and the finance to carry out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone, and we can start the debate right now. And let me stay with you for a moment, Simone. I understand you're saying the 55% target is both feasible and affordable, but what about the 60% target that the European Parliament has now put on the table? This is what the Parliament voted just a few weeks ago. Do you think that is feasible and affordable as well?
I don't know. Actually, I don't have a touch, and it would be very interesting to get Mr. Bourgeois' point of view on that, about the specific debate in the Parliament. And so I don't understand if the debate between 55% and 60% is in some way on the negotiating side of the. I would say, looking the world from the point of view of companies, of private investors, the 3% or 2% or 5% is important, but it's not the decisive. What is important is the ambition, is the signal that we have to put all our effort in order to focus on European investments in renewables, in electrification, in, for example, creating, that was mentioning in the previous intervention, for example, focusing on digitalizing the networks all around Europe in order to have a higher level of capability to manage the intermittent production on the European networks. Because again, there are all areas where we have the technologies. We probably all have a good consensus on the kind of regulation which is needed. So I don't really believe that the debate about between 55 or 60% is decisive. Technology is there. We are really, I mean, if that's not an L. If you ask to my colleagues, you will get the same answer. Give us the condition to carry out our investment, and we will deliver. We may deliver 55, we may deliver 60. But I think the very important problem now is to stop the discussion, define a number, and actually we are absolutely fine with 55, and creating the local condition to carry out the investment, because this is really the barrier.
Thanks, Simone. A similar question to you, Lisa Fischer. How big of a challenge do you think it is to reach that 55% goal? Simone Mori seems to be rather optimistic that it can be done, provided that the right framework for investment is put in place. What is your view?
Yeah, thanks. And it's encouraging to hear, Simone, from you that it's the level of ambition and the signaling around the level of ambition that really matters. I mean, of course, I don't think anyone is saying that achieving 55% or even 60% is an easy task. But it's probably also fair to say that not doing it won't be an easy task, because we'll be facing very different challenges in terms of adapting to climate change. I think, Frederick, it is feasible, it's achievable. The Commission impact assessment has demonstrated. I do think that in order to really meet those targets, we need to shed some old habits and up our game. And I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. One is, especially in the energy sector, now the transition is just so much more complex than where we are coming from, with the sort of focusing on the coal phase out and sort of encouraging renewables. We're now looking at really integrating energy systems, both on the supply side, midstream, and on the demand side. And in order to do that, I think we need to start putting science and independent science much more at the heart of our energy decisions, in order to do justice to the complexity of what we're facing, but also to just ensure that we deliver at speed, that we can learn as we go along, that we minimize the risk of failure, because that would be really detrimental to buy-in and the legitimacy of what we're doing. And in particular, that we take advantage of new energy solutions. And just to give you an example here, the process for planning our cross-European energy infrastructure at the moment is carried out by the electricity and the gas sector. It does not take into account the full range of energy solutions, in particular on the demand side, that we have to achieve energy security, grid stability, and so on and so forth. So this is really, for example, one of those areas, the upcoming revision of the TENI regulation, where we can make a leap forward by getting more science and independence into the process. The second thing I wanted to highlight is around ensuring that EU instruments really support the cutting edge, and not only just transitional solutions where we already know we need to phase them out again in 10, 20 years' time. I think the EU historically is really good at supporting green and phasing in green. It's not so good at stopping to support the more dirty technologies and solutions. And I don't think that's sufficient any longer if we go to 455. We really want to pick up the pace here. And again, to give you an example, there's modeling that 70% of our existing gas power stations would become uneconomic if at the same time we also pursue a policy that pushes demand-side response, pushes renewables. So if we continue to use public funds or instruments to support gas power, in particular in carbon-intensive regions, we're actually setting up ourselves for failure, and we're not investing in this competitiveness that I've been talking about earlier, which is about cost, access to low cost electricity, making our industries and energy use really super efficient, digitalizing it in order for us to be flexible, and also there's a big role for green hydrogen in terms of the potential for cost coming down, in terms of the jobs associated, in particular with the electricity part of green hydrogen production, which is where actually the majority of the jobs are. What I think is really important is we need to shed that habit of trying to pursue all options, keeping all doors open, because we won't achieve that speed. And in order to guide and inform that process, I think it's really important to have a much stronger embedding of science and independence in this process, so we can learn from failure, we can improve, we can determine when technologies or solutions don't work out and adjust our plans as fast as possible.
Thanks, Lisa. Interesting plea here for breakthrough technologies and the stopping to do sort of half, implementing half measures. Something more radical that needs to be done there. Understand you just said. Didrik Samson, maybe your views on the 2030 climate goals. In the impact assessment that the Commission did, there was a prediction of a slight increase in GDP if those goals are implemented, but there was also the possibility of a slight decrease. So you ended up favoring the option where there was a slight increase, obviously, but what were the main assumptions behind that analysis?
Yeah, to put it bluntly, it's the difference between implementing the target smart or stupid. But that's to put it bluntly, because the nuances are way bigger than that. But to summarize, if you want to increase the growth, but also the amount of jobs that this transition creates, you have to implement smart policies, including carbon pricing and redistribution of the revenues of that. You could do carbon pricing via taxes, then you have to redistribute the tax income, and you can do it via auctioning and an emission trading system, and then you have to redistribute the income from the auctions, the revenues from those auctions. If you don't do that, you run a risk of hampering your economic growth and also creating an unequal transition, an unfair, unjust transition. But if you set yourself to maximum amount of redistribution of those revenues, and why shouldn't you? Because those revenues are coming in via climate policies, and you have the option to redistribute them, redistribute them to your wishes. If you redistribute them as good as possible, you create a transition that increases the growth, not dramatically. It dramatically changes the direction of your growth, not the size of it. But to be fair, a sizable growth of 2% per year is good for Europe. Increase the amount of employment, not dramatically the amount of employment, but you do dramatically change the employment, and hence the redistribution need, for instance, for reskilling workers, and you also create a just transition. If you don't do that, if you defer from carbon pricing in the beginning, or do not redistribute the revenues from the carbon pricing, you run a risk of hampering growth and employment.
Didrik Samson, NL seems confident that the cost of the transition will be affordable. The Commission broadly shares this analysis, but not everyone shares that view. Poland, for instance, said at the last summit in October that further analysis was needed to assess the economic impact on individual countries. Can you tell us whether this analysis has been made? I understand some contacts needed to be made between the Commission and the Polish authorities. So can you tell us a bit how this has been going on? And what can you tell the skeptics 10 days before this EU summit meeting?
Yeah, well, first of all, the question to have a national analysis of the impact of the climate target is a justified one. The impact assessment that we published in September already gives you quite some information about where the impacts are, etc. And that also gives you, by definition, also a flavor of where the national impacts are going to be, what those impacts are exactly looking like. And add to that our analysis done in the context of the national energy and climate plans, we have quite some information. But first things first, we need to agree on an EU-wide target for 2030. Obviously, complemented with the commitment to share that target, to share the efforts to meet that target in a just way. Again, here the just transition is prominent in our policies. If we can agree on that, and well, most likely, hopefully, we will do that, or the European Council will do that on the 10th and 11th of December, then we can work our way to the legislative proposals, and in doing that, we will make detailed assessments of what national impacts of the overall target and the shared efforts will be. So I think we can convince, and we are indeed in the process of bilateral contacts, we can convince all member states, because it's not only Eastern European member states being interested in those national impacts, it's actually all member states are very interested in those, but we can agree on that with them on a pathway to getting us to the best possible outcome.
Thank you, Diederik Samson. Let me turn back to you now, Simone Mori. The electricity sector in Poland has pointed to a finance gap worth dozens of billions of euros to reach the 55% target for 2030. Now, do you share those worries, or are you confident when it comes to access to finance?
No, as I said, I think that generally speaking, we are very much convinced that there is a room for having a sound and a fresh private finance in the chain. Of course, I mean, as Diederik pointed out, I mean, this process as a quite important redistributive impact between the sectors, and then translating sectors in countries, because not all the countries are the same in Europe between countries, and of course it has to be taken into consideration. Not all the countries are going to have the same impact, and if I may just try to connect the two last points. The focus in order to, I really like the idea of the smart transition, the stupid transition, but the focus in order to get the smart transition is a technology, because as I said, we must be able to utilize the European resources in order to create a robust European value chain in the most critical technologies needed for the transition. Number one. Number two is education, skilling, upskilling. This is something that we are, inside our internal company, we are facing now, and we are not spending, we are not needing money. I mean, just transition is very important, but it has been a part of, let's say, just an idea to sustain a bit our internal policies. You have to retrain and upskill for example, our colleagues working in coal power plants, and make them able to do a different job internally in the company. So to become, for example, able to build or to maintain charging infrastructures for electrical mobility. So I would say that finance is not a big problem. I mean, there is once the routes are the good ones, able to unleash the investments and the proper technology, finance is not a problem. But about finance, I want to make another point. The recovery fund will put a lot of money into the table in order to sustain the transition, the kickoff of the transition. Of course, we are focusing on the first years of the decade, which is very important, and it's very important to connect this money, this fresh money, to the decarbonization. We believe that something smart, going back to the smart transition, could be done in order to facilitate the way this money is made available. And for example, we propose to the Commission a model that we are quite largely applying, for example, in our bond emissions, to connect the performance of the bond to some kind of top-down commitment on the decarbonization targets we have the ambition to achieve by the end of the decade. And this is very important. We believe that some specific points could be raised into the methodology utilized in order to allocate finance of the recovery fund, in order to make even easier the connection between the public finance that the European institutions are making available, the private finance, which is more than sufficient, and the leverage that these two things combined together may determine in order to facilitate investments in Europe. I see that Christian Bouzoy is with us. Good morning.
Good morning. I was here listening to you, Mr. Mori.
Yes,
good morning,
I'll turn to you in a second, Christian Bouzoy. Thanks and welcome for joining us, even though a little bit late. Simone Mori, let me maybe stay with you for one follow-up question. Maybe very briefly, in a few words, you're confident the 55% target can be met. That's great. But how would you summarize the main challenges as you see them now in implementing this? You mentioned the long lead times that it takes to put in place some renewable projects, issues with permitting. You mentioned issues related also to training. If you were to summarize the main ones that you see coming ahead, what would those challenges be?
Number one, permitting for new renewable plants. This is number one. This is just the main barrier today in mature countries. We may not have the transition if we don't have, megawatt and megawatts of new renewable plants, cheap, efficient, high-tech renewable plants put in place, especially during the first half of the decade. Number two, which is very connected to that, this permitting process has not to be just effective and efficient, but also harmonized in order to create a pan-European ground field where the European operators may compete and may develop the projects. Number three, we believe that electrification is the cheapest way to bring this decarbonized electricity to the final customer and to displace fossil fuels and emissions at the level of the final customers. What is needed here, basically, as a prerequisite, is an effort of infrastructure, overcoming some technological barriers, such as charging infrastructures, some strange, again, local regulation preventing, for example, some energy efficiency for the final users. But I would say there is a big picture which may be realized by winning many, I would say, day-by-day battles with especially the domestic regulation.
Thank you, Simone Mori. Let me turn to you, Lisa Fischer, now about the main challenges as you see them coming up in the next decade to implement those climate targets, whatever they may end up being, whether 55 or 60%.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one of them I've already mentioned, which is around consistency of what we're doing and accommodating the complexity. I mean, the agenda the European Commission has set out for next year is very ambitious in terms of legislative files. I think it's really important that we don't end up with sort of negotiations and lowest common denominator in the end of each of them, but that really provides an overall strategic direction in line with 55%. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to ensure that next year. How are we going to get visibility over whether we are on track in terms of the delivery legislation, in particular on energy efficiency, renewables, and so on. So that's one of them. I think the other one that Diederik has touched on as well is building really the aspect of fairness into our policy design, because I think what would be extremely counterproductive is failure in the early days around, getting fairness right. If people feel like the actual price benefits of this transition and comfort benefits, if it's about air pollution, it's about warmer homes, more affordable energy bills because you're consuming less. And if we get that wrong initially, I think that's an issue. So we need to think really carefully about how to build fairness into our policy design early on. That's of course about transitioning carbon-intensive regions, but it's so much more than that. It's about reskilling, ensuring that the quality of the new jobs is high in terms of job security and so on and so forth. But also that, for example, those who can't at this point in time can't afford low carbon solutions such as renovation, heat pumps, because the upfront costs are high, aren't the ones who are in the end losing out, maybe being left on the gas grid, footing the bill of the grid, whilst everyone else has moved on. So we really need to think about this dynamics much more, about how we share costs and benefits in this transition, and be very careful about how we build that into our policy design. And then last, again, I've touched on that briefly, but I think it's really important that we start not only promoting the green stuff, but also being very clear about where some of the technologies or solutions are no longer in line with our pathways. That does not mean member states can't do them if they want to do them, but it means there is no EU support for that, or it can't be classified as sustainable. Because I think that really changes the dynamic. We have seen, I think, in the Netherlands, when there was a conversation about phasing out gas boilers, that really boosted the heat pump market. And it's those dynamics that where we are certain we need to trigger, otherwise we won't get the speed we want.
Thank you, Lisa Fischer. And so let me turn to you now, Christian Bourgeois. You're chairman of the Industry Committee in the European Parliament. What do you see as the biggest challenges lying ahead in the next decade when it comes to implementing the package of targets that will hopefully soon be agreed among the member states, and then with the legislative package that is expected next year from the European Commission? What would you single out as the biggest challenges coming up?
Thank you so much, and sorry for the little delay. I'm not only the president of Industry, Research and Energy Committee, but also the rapporteur for the health program of European Union, and this was the reason, tough negotiations. I think that the biggest challenge, in my opinion, will be the economic crisis, and even that until now, the political will is very clear, and it was reassured always by European Parliament, by the member states. There is still an unknown territory ahead of us due to the economic crisis, because of course, and here I go what Mr. Mori emphasized, very rightly, the financing of this transition will be extremely important. We have at our disposal the European funds, the two directions, the MFF, the 7-year European budget, where a lot of the funds will be related with our 2050 strategic goal of decarbonization, and of course the 2030 intermediate target. And of course we have the next generation, where also the Green Deal ambitions should be financed. But it's not enough. The European money are not enough in order to achieve our ambitions. We need, of course, private investments from the companies that will have to change a lot in their structure, and we need also national budgets. And at least for 2030, because this is what we are focusing today, we have to take into account the economic crisis. But hopefully we will overcome this also with the help of EU funds. With your member states already have very good plans in order to deal with the crisis that will come after the COVID-19 pandemic, and I hope that finally we'll achieve what we are proposing. Second, we need, of course, to go with feasible ambitions, with feasible goals. And this is something that we should not forget. In order to achieve the decarbonization target for 2030, we need an achievable target, one that is economically feasible. And for this reason, I believe that 55% proposed by European Commission will be something which is not easy to achieve. Remember, please, that we discussed a lot years previously to go to 40%. And if we go beyond this, if we go to 60%, with what the European Parliament already took into discussion and presented as a position, then it will be even more challenging. We need to enhance synergies between Green Deal, Recovery Fund, and other instruments. We have to look to the green recovery as a win-win strategy. And here I totally agree with Executive Vice President Timmermans that we need to use this opportunity to have at our disposal important funds and not to go to the old framework, to the old technologies, but to use this to invest in new technologies and also to help us also to take the lead at the international level. But please do not forget about the another principle, which will be to leave nobody behind and no regions behind. And here the Just Transition Fund and not only will play an important role. There are countries which could achieve this easily. There are other countries where the challenge will be higher, the burdens will be higher, and also the result will be more difficult to achieve. I look also to my country, Romania. We are fully committed to go in this direction. We go from a good starting point because we already have a good part of our mix from renewable sources, due mainly to the hydropower inherited from the past, of course, but it is important part of our mix. We have also an important part in the nuclear energy, which is not necessarily seen as a renewable, of course, but which helps us. Here we cannot have European funds, but we should also take into account what we do with the regions which are depending on coal. We need the gas for the transition, and we should not forget, and this is the case also of other Central, East European and Baltic countries, that we need also to not to forget the security of energy supply, the accessibility of energy from a price point of view. We should not forget about jobs. This is everywhere. I'm sure that also in the most developed countries, the jobs are extremely important. And of course, our economic competitiveness, because even that we see important changes at the international arena, China is committed more and more to go in this direction. What happens at the elections in the United States give us a lot of good hopes that also at the federal level the situation will change, but still we need to remain competitive. And many of our industries will have to remain competitive. And for this, we need feasible targets. So we go in this direction. The Parliament is backing. It's even overambitious sometimes, like with the 60% target. But this is my personal opinion, not necessarily the committee opinion. But we still have to look closely to this because all the factors should be taken into account. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian Bușoi. And let me stay with you for one follow-up question about the negotiations which took place in the European Parliament on the budget and the recovery fund. We saw the European Parliament pushing really hard to get as much funding as possible, actually getting a few wins in this respect. Quite spectacularly, we also even saw an MEP, Pierre Larouturou, starting a hunger strike to raise awareness about what he saw as a lack of finance to meet the 2030 climate goals in particular. So what is your view? Are you worried as well about a lack of funding to meet the 2030 climate goals?
Not really. I believe that what we have now, it's a good balance on the needs of the member states, which are not all related on climate change meeting targets and on Green Deal and green recovery, and what we need to achieve in this area, the transformation of our energy systems, of our transportation or agriculture, and some heavy industries. So here the balance is right. And we achieved something important, which is the increase of the Horizon Europe program. And it is also not only the opinion of European Parliament, but also the opinion of industry and other important stakeholders that without research and innovation and without advancing fast some achievements in the technology area, it would be difficult to make some of the green technologies of today ready in order to help us to achieve the targets. I'm worried about the problem of the rule of law, because I see two member states heavily and which for the moment are decided to veto and to block everything. And of course we have a plan B, but let's not go on this very easily, because then we'll put into question a lot of other issues, even the European idea. So I hope that they will become reasonable, the two member states, and they will accept that we need also the rule of law, and nobody will exaggerate on this, but in the same time we have to respect some principles, because otherwise it is difficult to advance. I believe for the moment to answer to your question, we have a good balance, and a lot of European funds will go in this direction, and I'm satisfied with this.
Diederik Samson, turning to you now about the biggest challenges as you see them coming up in the next decade to implement the new package coming up. I mean, there were already challenges to meet the 40% target, so now going up to 55% means you need to go much faster. Europe collectively needs to go much faster. Simone Mori mentioned issues such as permitting for wind farms, where he sees there the need for greater harmonization maybe. Can you tell us your views on what could be done from a European level to accelerate the transition and the biggest challenges that you see coming ahead?
Yeah, to be fair, I don't think finance are our biggest challenges. Not to say that they're easy, but you already mentioned the -40 target. If we would have stayed the course and did nothing, we would have met the -40 target, or actually overshot it with a few percentages. Thanks to the incredible developments in if you can see the cost curves of solar energy, they are really mind-boggling, and the same is actually applicable to offshore wind or electrical cars. And also the finance, I mean, we discussed the European budget, which is impressive, well, all the are to complement for it. Let's cross our fingers that we will get it to the finish line very soon. But we require much more in order to finance this transition, 350 billion in investments per annum in the energy system alone. No, by far the biggest challenge is to create a just transition, to enshrine fairness into this transition, because as we know from every transition has a sort of a Darwinistic nature. It always tends to end up with more money and more power in the hands of fewer people, and raises both the wealth in a society, thanks for that, but also the inequality in that society. And what we've done in the past is always to repair that damage afterwards as good as we could, and Europe is pretty good at it. We are a pretty fair society, a pretty fair continent, but we cannot afford to repeat that recipe this time. The transition is way too big, we are in way too much hurry, and the population will just not accept it, rightly so. So to create a fair, balanced transition, that is our biggest challenge at the moment. And that's also the reason why we, for instance, put the renovation wave, which was just one element in the Green Deal, we now put it front and center in the context of the recovery package, because that recovery package we know will press fast forward on the Green Deal, and I'm happy with that. But we also do realize that the economy is in reverse, so the gap is only getting bigger in terms of creating a just transition. The renovation wave might help us, and it's just one example, basically creating a triple whammy. Obviously, you increase sustainability by renovating homes, you increase investments, and you create jobs, medium enterprises, but also you create a lower energy bill for the people living in those houses. And if we would target the renovation waves, especially towards the affordable housing sector in which the people live that don't have a high income and that could use some extra purchasing power in times of crisis, we might be on the right track to create a just transition. But this is the real challenge, because writing it down, developing, that's just one part of the game. Implementing it so that people understand it and see the merits of it, also personally, that's the real challenge.
Thank you, Diederik Samson. To stay with you now on the tools, the instruments that will be put in place next year, this big package coming up in June. At the heart of that package, we're not going to discuss every proposal in there, but there will be the emissions trading scheme, which is going to be revised once again. Can you maybe outline the main the main issues, the main challenges that you will try to address with that reform?
Well, the main thing is obviously to create a steeper decline towards climate neutrality in 2050 and passing the -55 milestone in 2030. So you need a reduction factor or a lower base. That's obviously for the techies amongst us the main challenge. But also we are looking into the merits of extending the scope of the ETS over buildings and road transport in order to create pricing incentives in those sectors too, and to create a system in which you can most efficiently, most effectively reduce the emissions over there. That is now all being researched. All those options are looked at in an impact assessment, and we hope to be soon with the results of that.
Yes, and on the extension of the ETS to transport, your boss, Frans Timmermans, has said personally that he was a bit skeptical about that because it risked, it's something that risks pushing up the price of fuel. And we saw with the yellow vests in France how that could end up, right? So I guess this will be one of the things that you will be looking at with a lot of attention during this impact assessment that you've started.
Yes, and as politicians do in Europe, at least, we tend to be convinced by the facts. So we are awaiting that impact assessment with anxiety and see where we. It is already clear that whatever you do with the scope of the ETS, our main instrument in the transport sectors are still there, which is, for instance, the CO2 emission standards for cars. And we will keep those instruments because we already know that even extending the ETS will not in itself be enough to the transport sector. We need additional regulation, and hence the complex system of the Fit for 55 package that we will come up with in June 2021, because you can understand that extending the ETS while also keeping other regulations has some interactive effects, and we need to take them into account too, indeed, in order to ensure a fair transition.
Thank you, Diederik Samson. Let me turn to you again now, Simone Mori. From Enel's perspective, what changes do you think should be brought to the ETS in order to meet the 2030 goal? Are you, for example, in favor of something like a carbon price floor?
I tend to agree 100% with what Mr. Samson just said. As several members of European Parliament know, Enel has been probably the most active player in pushing a reform of ETS during the last years. We have been pushing a lot for market stability reserve. We are pushing a lot about the reinforcement of the mechanism for having some injection of flexibility in order to match demand and supply as a normal market does usually. And because we truly believe that ETS is a very important instrument for achieving some result, not all the results. We may not rely on ETS for everything. ETS has had an incredible role. It's having an incredible role today in squeezing the coal generation out of the power market. It's a pity that we don't highlight this so much, because it seems, ETS today is we tend to take for granted the good results we got in the past and in order to discuss about the future. But actually, one of the reasons why many countries in Europe are considering the idea of getting rid of coal plants in a relatively short period of time is also because these plants are becoming less and less competitive from the point of view of the economics. And this is thanks to ETS. It's working very well. So I don't believe that we should change this mechanism. Now it's time to consolidate and to consolidate the model, going through the lines we already know. Of course, once we increase the ambition of decarbonization in Europe, probably we have to adapt the supply of credits at the new level. Probably we may do something more in order to eliminate definitively the long, because we believe that, of course, the mechanism is a dynamic mechanism. I fully agree about the fact that when we have to attack other segments, we may not rely too much on ETS. I think that, for example, for transport, standards and targets of decarbonization are much more effective. Look at how the car makers changed I say that with a lot of respect for them. Right? They are working out in order to face and to win the challenge of electrical mobility. How that attitude changed before the definition of a target of decarbonization for the private fleets and after that. So it's much more positive, it's much more open to the pushing investment in technologies. So again, as we mentioned, the renovation way. Again, I fully agree with that. We are seeing now. We are looking at the effect of a measure that the Italian government, my country, Italian government, just put in place, which is called eco bonus. It's a way to promote rejuvenation, refurbishment, and energy efficiency into the real estate sector. And of course, I mean, you need some very simple mechanism, easy to be understood by citizens, because the energy transition will fly because the citizen will buy and will promote and will be the players of the energy transition. Of course, we may start to think at more sophisticated models, trying to entangle other segments into the ETS for the midterm, looking at some CBAs and carbon border adjustment that may be a solution in order to avoid, environmental dumping. But I mean, again, it's a very tricky and complex issue. I would keep this focus on the major sectors, probably the very high carbon intensive sectors such as power, cement, steel, chemistry. But I wouldn't put any revolution into the present model of ETS, which is delivering just the fine tuning of the parameters. But for example, the carbon floor is something injecting the principle of a carbon tax into the ETS, which is, I think, contrary to the right dynamics that ETS has to have.
Thank you, Simone Mori. Christian Boujoy, let me turn to you. Your expectations for the June package, the Fit for 55 package, what are your expectations there in terms of the main instruments that you believe are needed in order to bring Europe over the line when it comes to reaching the climate goals?
Of course, the revision of the current legislation should take into account the acceleration of the transformation of our energy systems, and not only. This is something very clear. We started with the energy system integration, which was very good. The renovation wave was mentioned, and this will help a lot and have not only a strategic value for achieving our targets 2030 and 2050, but as it was stated by European Commission, will be very helpful also in the coming years of possible economic crisis, because this is something very concrete that will provide jobs, that will help the local and regional economy, and also, of course, very important, will help us by renovating our buildings to achieve easier our targets. We are waiting now for the 10-year regulation, which will be also extremely important on the long term, because now we'll have to accommodate projects that will take into account the new realities. And even for the gas pipelines, for instance, we'll need to design them with the help of European money, with the PCI's type of projects, to be ready also to transport hydrogen, or to be ready for the future. And then, of course, we have for the next year a very ambitious legislative programs. We didn't enter yet into discussions, but we will remain in dialogue with Commissioner Kadri Simpson, with Director General Dieter Jorgensen, and of course with Vice President Timmermans on how this legislation should be changed in order to accelerate, to foster the transformation. We need, of course, new incentives. We have to in order to develop more the renewables, in order to build a market for hydrogen, for instance. We have the strategy which was well received, but we need also to invest and to give incentives for investment, for private investment, for production, for storage, for transportation, and also on the CCS, we need to do something in order to implement this and to make it more competitive. So this kind of practical issues we expect in order to accelerate things, because otherwise it will be difficult to achieve 55% target.
Thank you, Christian Bourgeois. Let me put that question now to you, Lisa Fischer. When it comes to achieving the 2030 climate goals, what do you think the instruments that are needed? We just heard from Christian Bourgeois the need to finance some infrastructure, things like hydrogen, refurbishing pipelines in the T&E regulation. So what are your views on that?
Thanks. I'm completely agree that the 10-year regulation is immensely important, and to get that right. I just wanted to one step back. Of course, next year, the level of ambition is key, and matching the level of ambition across renewables directive, energy efficiency, and so on, gas package, with our medium-term 2030 target, but also the long-term target. It's really important we keep that in mind, especially when it comes to the gas package as well. And in terms of, again, because you've mentioned hydrogen, I think level of ambition on renewables, it's also important that if we really want to, get green hydrogen off the ground, that means we've got to accelerate our curve on renewables compared to even the sort of 55% business as usual. So that's something we think we need to keep in the conversation. The 10-year regulation, which is, I think, already expected this year, is incredibly critical. And I wanted to point out a few elements. I mean, I think in terms of the principle of energy efficiency first, which I think is key to aspects that we've mentioned in this discussion around fairness, around well-being of people, around keeping the costs of the transition low. I think the 10-year regulation is the first one that needs to demonstrate that it embeds that principle across the board in the planning stage, but also in terms of eligibility of projects. I agree also that Christian mentioned, the discussion around pipelines has changed. As I said in my opening remarks, I think we want to make sure we're not accidentally stuck in the analog world of pipelines where this is no longer needed. It's quite clear that we do not need to expand our gas infrastructure for the purpose of transporting methane. We might need some infrastructure to, match renewable hydrogen sources with hydrogen demand in industry. That might sometimes be the same infrastructure as gas infrastructure, sometimes that's different infrastructure. It's going to be very localized and limited. I think there might be a role for the 10-year regulation to take some of this forward. But I think it needs to be linking again back to my opening remarks, grounded in science and in a real assessment over, this is where we think low cost renewable hydrogen will come from. I think Romania is a key country to think about developing renewables capacity for that purpose. So yeah, I think 10-year regulation is really important. I just wanted to, in terms of the bigger discussion we had around the ETS and the big flagship instruments next year, I'm just going back to, again, the principle of fairness. I think we need to make sure it's visible to the public that we have a polluter pays principle enshrined across the board, that the consumer isn't picking up stuff that should be picked up by the polluter or companies themselves. We need to look at consistency. Some examples, we might want to promote green hydrogen, but it's a drop in the ocean if at the same time grey hydrogen is exempt from ETS coverage. So there is a lot of reading across we need to do. And again, I'd be interested to hear also from Diederik Samson where he sees that land, who will be carrying that function of making sure these incentives stack up, which is key for both fairness, but also for actually mobilizing the finance, in particular private finance, into the right direction. And this is where I also just wanted to briefly touch on extending the ETS in terms of scope. I think, yes, the ETS has done a job in the power sector in terms of coal. We need to think about what it can do in terms of gas and starting to steer that sector into the future. Of course, it doesn't cover methane emissions at the moment, so there's some limitations here. I'm a little bit more skeptical around the ETS coverage, especially for the heating sector, just because I think, like what was outlined beforehand, this is really about system change here, and this needs to be driven bottom up by local communities, checking what are their resources for heat decarbonization. It could quite easily otherwise backfire that it just adds to the price of consumers. They don't actually have the long-term visibility or the financial means to swap from one heat appliance to another, for example. So I think it can be done, but there's a big risk built into it, and I think we need to think carefully about how it could be done if we want to do that.
Thanks, Lisa Fischer. We'll turn to Didrik Samson in a few minutes, but before that, Simone Mori, maybe you can give us your views from Enel's perspective on hydrogen. I understand the strategy of Enel is quite clear. It's electrification first, and this is pretty much in line as well with what the Commission has been saying, is electrify as much as possible, but not everything can be electrified. So what is Enel's approach to hydrogen?
No, exactly. We believe that this is that now finally the debate is landing in a very wise and rational field, in the sense that there was a kind of strange confrontation between people, apparently people pushing for electrification and people pushing for hydrogen, as it were, two alternatives, which is not. It is clear, as you just said, that there is no way to achieve the full decarbonization by 2050 without the deployment of hydrogen in several industrial sectors. Hydrogen, which has to be produced by renewable. Then the idea has to be clearly, the long-term vision is clearly the green hydrogen idea. There's no doubt about it. I think there is a total consensus, and also what the Commission is proposing is absolutely in line with this approach. Then on the field of hydrogen, what we have to do now is to develop a technology to create the condition, as I mentioned at the beginning, for having an European technological leadership in this field, which means basically, again, looking at the long term to sustain the growth and the consolidation of a European leadership into the electrolyzers, because those are clearly the key tools for bringing for getting the result of having cheap renewable hydrogen by 2040, 2050. And then we also have to start to explore business models wisely, putting appropriately the money the Commission wants to invest in this segment, starting from the clear priority today, which is decarbonizing the hydrogen production, which is already in place. Europe is producing hydrogen through a quite carbon-intense technology. So my perception is that our efforts altogether for the next decade have to be to create a technological presence of Europe, to explore the business model through different schemes which have to be supported, because today, unfortunately, hydrogen is a quite expensive way to reduce carbon emissions versus all the alternatives that we already have mentioned, renewables, electricity, electrification, energy efficiency, etc. So now it's time to work in order to establish the technological leadership, exploring the business models, and lowering the emissions of the hydrogen production sector, which is already in place. And we are pretty much confident that at the end of this decade, and probably we will have very good surprises. But we are pretty much confident that as it happened in the renewable production, for example, how it is happening in the battery technology, we will see very good surprises putting together the efforts of the private operators and the industries working on that, and of course the public support of European finance, which is very much active in this field.
Thank you, Simone Mori. Let me turn now to Diederik Samson for a quick comment about hydrogen and the transition. In the hydrogen strategy, the Commission has taken a clear stance in favor of green hydrogen produced from renewables, but the strategy also acknowledges the role that hydrogen produced from natural gas with CCS can play in the transition in order to get there. So how does the Commission plan to manage this transition without compromising the end objective, which is to go for 100% renewable hydrogen?
Yes, our renewable hydrogen in the end, but the fact that we see for blue hydrogen is fact, and we actually needed to break the chicken and egg problem and establish a hydrogen economy, or at least to establish parts of the economy on a hydrogen basis, being it the electricity sector that needs, when it quickly goes to renewables, needs hydrogen in the system to stabilize demand and supply, but also for the industry, the hard to abate sectors, or as a raw material for some industries even. We need to speed up the demand and supply for hydrogen, and we can only do that at the speed required when we give a role to blue hydrogen. And the way we manage it is the way we manage all of those transitions, by gradually and carefully financing it and withdrawing those finances when needed. Regulation was mentioned before in this debate, which is another example of that. I mean, we've seen the 10E regulation move from a scheme that supported everything, every fossil fuel, by the way, to a scheme that supports natural gas to a large extent, and we hope to be able to publish that in a few weeks' time, to a completely new framework in which we put our eyes on the horizon and finance the things that are needed for, and support those things that are needed for the renewable energy system. And the same is true for hydrogen. So we put our eyes on the horizon, looking at that 100% green hydrogen future, but we also acknowledge the fact that in order to get there, we might need a transitional phase of blue hydrogen, and we adapt our financing schemes according to that vision.
Thank you, Diederik Samson. Very clear answer on that. I think we're reaching, unfortunately, the end of this online event. Maybe before we close, I will ask each one of you to, in a very quick few sentences, say what you would like our audience to take home with them from this conference. Maybe we can start with you, Lisa Fischer.
Yeah, thanks. I want to make one comment on the hydrogen and then one concluding sentence. I'll be quick. I think the hydrogen question is easy in the sense that, you set standards in line with the Paris Agreement based on science. If anyone thinks they can, pull CCS off and blue hydrogen and it makes sense in that time horizon, they should go ahead with it. The support from the Commission should be focusing on, as Diederik Samson said, the end point. I think what the audience should take away, I really enjoyed that there was a big focus on the electricity system, on flexibility, on really putting our efforts into that. I think that in the past, the discussion has moved away a little bit from that, but I'm very optimistic we can get back to that discussion, centering on the electricity system, on demand-side response, energy efficiency first, which are the core ingredients of the transition to 55% and net zero. And I hope that this is what we'll see next year with the Commission agenda as well.
Thank you, Lisa Fischer. Christian Bourgeois, maybe a few concluding words from your end, a main message you'd like our audience to take home with them.
Thank you so much. I believe that the transformation of our energy sector and the transition towards green needs to be balanced, needs to be feasible for all our regions and also for all our industrial sectors. As I said, I believe no region should be left behind and no sector of industry should be further affected, especially given the COVID-19 economic impact, which we don't know today, but hopefully it will not be very big, but still we have to take it into account. I also believe that through a green recovery, member states will have the opportunity to unleash innovation, to undertake wider reaching and fundamental restructuring of critical sectors, to accelerate existing climate ambitions and make use of sustainable energy plans. But and also the green recovery will help member states to restore their economies while deepening their energy transition, and at the same time to create jobs and certainty to investors. So a big opportunity, an important opportunity. We should use it. We should take advantage of this, but in the same time, do not forget that everything should be feasible and balanced. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian Bujoy. Simone Mori, a few concluding words from your end.
We are convinced that the transition will lead to an Europe which will be cleaner, more sustainable, richer, with more and better jobs, no doubt about it. We have to go through a smart transition, as has been said, and but I think that during the discussion, the meaning of smart has been pretty well identified. But we believe time is now, in the sense that putting together the effort of the New Green Deal and the targets and the huge amount of resources of the recovery, well, this is the time to make all these wave of investments durable by unleashing the let's say the animal spirits of the investors and all the effort that the private sector may bring in order to anticipate and carry on the project needed in order to achieve those results.
Diederik Samson, you have the privilege now of the closing words. What would be the main message that you would like our viewers to take home with them?
Well, actually, I'm doing this all my adult life so far, and I've never seen a bigger consensus nor a momentum than I see right now to make this happen. Consensus on where we need to go, but also, more importantly, on the road to get there. And also in terms of a society's willingness or even demand to start this transition right now, and an industry's readiness to embark on this new journey towards a sustainable economy. Really, that is remarkable. And even more remarkable in these times of COVID-19 pandemic, which in a strange twist of events strengthened the consensus and also strengthened the readiness of the industry to make this jump into the future. So I've never been more optimistic in my adult life on the question, can we make this happen? The answer is yes.
Thank you very much, Diederik Samson. I think this wraps today's event. A big thanks to Enel for supporting this event. Thank you as well to all the panelists for your time, and to our viewers as well for following us. In case you liked this debate, we have many more coming on Euractiv in the coming weeks. Just check our website, events.euractiv.com, for more detail. And if you've missed the beginning of this event, well, you will be soon able to watch the video again on YouTube. So we hope to see you again soon. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Bye-bye.